So, I've done a few videos on the channel on the subject of mentors and Mentor Roulette, and many of the comments suggest that the Mentor Roulette itself is horrendous. Like, just in general, given this or that reason. Some particular ones that are commonly brought up is that mentors always leave hard content, and also to some extent that hard content is common in Mentor Roulette, at least to some people. Others claim that it's all MSQ roulette in the Mentor Roulette, and yet others still claim that it is all Guildhests. So I went and did 20 Mentor Roulettes as Sage in a 6-hour-ish time span. I didn't expect my last one to go overtime because of the roulette I got. And if you are curious, I had a total of 1 wipe. And that was more because of a random misunderstanding than actual failure of the group. So in this video, I just wanted to go over what I saw and what I did in these Mentor Roulettes, which I will present in this order. Guildhests, quote-unquote, casual difficulty trials and raids, dungeons in order from low to high level, quote-unquote, non-casual difficulty trials, and finally MSQ roulette. And yes, you are absolutely right, we already started with the Guildhests. There's just not anything particularly remarkable to talk about in Guildhests. In fact, the first Guildhest was so challenging that I was fiddling with finding the Mentor achievement before we finished, and still didn't manage to take the picture before we did. For that reason, you will simply have to take my word for it when I say I started with 13 cleared Mentor Roulettes. The second Guildhest is slightly more interesting, since its entire gimmick is that it focuses on debuffs, so much so that all debuffs in the duty are removable, and the NPC even says to use Asuna in a text message. The debuffs are Poison, Thunder, Silence, and Pacify. You know, the kinda debuffs you'd care to remove. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the actual worthwhile to remove debuffs lasts so little time that there's basically no point in bothering to remove them. With that, we go on to the casual difficulty trials and raids. For this Ifrit fight, perhaps shockingly, everyone switched to the nail. Even the tank, which was rewarded for their choice to do so by the frontal cone tank buster being used just before that, meaning that there was very little worth talking about. The frontal cone breath that happened shortly after was something I'm pretty confident the tank had no ability to prevent. For our second encounter, we have Alte Reute. I love that name, where, again, it seems everyone knows what they're doing. The only particular outlier is that the tank buster, which hits the main tank, and whoever's closest to them, was kind of just ignored. Even though it nearly killed the DPS twice. No one really died though, so And that leads us to the dungeons section. Again, to everyone's shock I'm sure, the lowest level dungeon I ended up in was not Sastasha, but Braveflock's Longstop. In both runs, because there were 2, the tank happened to be very new to their role, and naturally their job. In both cases, they rarely used defensive cooldowns if at all, but at least they took my advice when I recommended they simply use their AoE attack on multiple targets. One of them realized multiple meant 3, and the other took it as 2, which is perfectly fine. While the correct answer is 3, it seemed like alternating targets might already be an unnecessary complexity if they're already dealing with learning the absolute basics of tanking. They held aggro, they didn't pull more than they could handle, and it was fine. You may be wondering why I specifically went as a healer here, and the answer to that is that while a warrior, for example, can carry and do most higher level content entirely on their lonesome, in lower level content, any tank may require healer assistance, and a great tank may find it difficult to compensate for a bad healer. However, a great healer can, even in low-level content, often compensate for a bad tank. You might also be wondering why I didn't pester the tanks to pull more or use defensives and the like. But essentially, if you overwhelm someone with information, they are likely to either stop listening, feel overwhelmed, and or give up because it is overwhelming. They might also get offended. Focusing on teaching just the one most important thing at the moment. For example, the easiest way to hold aggro when it seems to be a problem is more likely to stick. Next, I had a run in Cutter's Cry, where everyone kind of waited for each other in that awkward bit between the first and the second boss, leading to no one dying. Quite impressive. There's not much else to highlight here. Everyone seemed to be doing their job pretty well. We even managed to have no one dying on the final boss. Although that one might be attributed to the fact that the boss really preferred Dragon's voice that day. After that, we had 2 runs in the vault, where in both cases it seems our tank was a returning player who didn't know about Stalwart Soul. Aside from situations where you could pull more, not necessary but you could, there was nothing else really to write home about here. In one of the runs, the DPS players needed a bit of help with the chains. Now, in this Self-Atoll run, we had an interesting group with a warrior and a machinist who, to my observation, knew exactly what they were doing. And a returning player Thaumaturge, who, it turns out, had forgot to put on their job crystal. Amazing what happens when you ask. I gave them some advice after the dungeon. Despite everything, the dungeon run itself took less than 17 minutes. Entering into the Stormblood level range, we have Shisui of the Violet Tides, and there was actually nothing special here. I mean, aside from the fact that the tank hesitated on the Gigapull after the first boss. Understandable, but if you do hesitate, you should probably stop rather than continue, so nothing bad happened. That is also to say, nothing particularly special happened. I also had 2 runs in Bardam's Metal, back to back even. Oh yeah, the first one of them also took a while to actually enter. The only particularly eventful thing in the dungeon to me is the first big pull of the dungeon, where you may notice that the 2 tanks decided to do it slightly differently. The summoner that died in one of the runs probably died because of going full blast while the tank was still pulling. Despite that, things went fine. Neither tank decided to do the full Gigapull, which is understandable. Also, did you know you can do most of this boss walking? And with that, we get to the Shadowbringers Dungeons, starting with Hallminster Switch. I have in a previous video, of course, highlighted that the first few packs, and also the packs after the first boss, are particularly mean in this dungeon, due to a combination of just a lot of dudes, and debuffs that are painful to deal with. It turned out that the tank was in full item level 385, which is perfectly fine, but quote-unquote undergeared compared to what you could have and what you'd expect the average tank to have when synced down. To be honest, I was really hoping for Super Polite here specifically. Later, we had a wipe after the first boss because we got separated a bit too far from each other. That was the only wipe I had the entire day. The tank also admitted that they still felt quite new at the job, which is fine. After that, I landed in Malika's Well, where nothing special happened. The only notable thing is that it seemed the tank was trying to use Holy Circle for healing, since that would help at higher level. I think they figured out the problem themselves, since after the first boss they stopped doing that. I didn't say anything about it, and no one else did either. And for an Endwalker leveling dungeon, we had Tower of Babel, where, mechanically, nothing particularly noteworthy happened. I guess there was a little misunderstanding on the second boss with the platforms, but I guess the samurai was a sprout, and it was probably their first time there. In retrospect, I could probably have saved them, had I not been too focused on my own attacking in between chakrams. My bad. Oh yeah, also, look at this excellent dancer! For the final dungeon, I had Alzadal's Legacy, where I was a replacement. Weirdly, this was more concerning than queuing into 8-man content. Overall, there were a lot of mistakes. Unfortunately, I discovered I found myself in a group that I could probably not teach very much, given that we didn't share a common language. There was also quite a lot to unpack, so I felt there was little point trying. Fortunately, we had no wipes. Moving into the non-casual trials, we start with Urths Fount, which is easily missable as content, given that it is a hard extreme somewhere like that. That is entirely optional. Odin here can absolutely wipe you, he is quite a healer chick. However, it was one of the fastest roulettes I had that day. I found it particularly hilarious that basically all the mentors in the group admitted outright they had no idea how the fight worked. The most dangerous part of this fight, assuming your healer's up to the task, is that it finishes with a DPS check. And then for the big high point, I landed in Shiva Extreme and expected to be here for a while. However, somehow we managed. It turns out the shield bash when she switches to sword and shield doesn't require everyone to be stacked to survive it. And even if you overlap a spread marker with the circle AoEs, most players seem to survive it. However, there was one particular mechanic that Shiva was not to be deterred on. when she draws that bow, you must get behind her. Otherwise, well, yeah, you're probably not wondering why half of the raid spent a lot of the time dead. The only reason why we could do it this way is of course because Shiva has a surprisingly lenient enrage timer and instead relies on a gradually increasing damage buff as the fight progresses along to stress the party up until the final hard enrage. While I'm just letting this footage play out for a bit, I just wanted to talk a bit general on Mentor Roulette. You may have noticed I had a massive majority of leveling dungeons. I'm pretty confident, without checking, that the reason for that is that healers are needed in most roulettes, including leveling roulette, which is very popular. So by simply choosing a very needed role, you're more likely to land in the more common content. Compare that to queuing as a DPS, where you would first of all be much more likely to sit in the queue for a while, but also be much more likely to land in hard content, because no easy content needed a DPS. An argument for queuing as DPS for Mentor Roulette is that a very competent DPS can significantly impact the total duty time, but so can a very competent tank or healer. The benefit of mentoring as healer to me is that it gives you reason to look at the rest of the team more, which gives more opportunities to teach. And while in some duties you will have a tank that doesn't really need you, most of the time, you being capable of carrying a bad tank is going to be much more impactful than doing more damage as a DPS. At least, in my opinion. Another thing worth considering is that, obviously, when you queue for Mentor Roulette matters. You will probably not be shocked to find that the Alzadal's Legacy run came shortly after the daily reset, whilst the Shiva Extreme run here came after I sat in the queue for a good minute where the roulette could find nothing else for me to do, in the middle of the day on a workday. It made perfect sense that I would land there of all places. I also just want to reiterate, while we are here, that because we didn't wipe, this Shiva Extreme run was shorter than even the most competent dungeon group runs I had that day. Although, of course, Urths Fount, Ifrit and Guildhests were significantly shorter than that. I also want to highlight that while there is this weird claim that is floating about that all mentors are bad, all 3 mentors in the Shiva Extreme fight seem to be surviving better than the rest of the group, which is of course to be expected, but still. And of course, to finish my day, my last roulette landed me in Praetorium, and that is why it took me 6 hours and a bit rather than 6 hours. Just for some extra notes, I experienced no one being toxic, and everyone who I gave advice took it in a positive way. Yes, there were many groups that had players that didn't perform incredibly well, but given that they for the most part didn't pull more than they themselves were capable of dealing with a bit of help from the mentor of course, that wasn't really an issue. To me, it is a much bigger problem if, for example, the tank pulls full blast but doesn't know how to use defensive cooldowns right. Or if DPS starts pulling for the tank when it was perhaps not a good idea. Given that this didn't happen, there was no issue. Something that I might have neglected to mention is that all these Mentor Roulettes took place on the EU Chaos Data Center. Maybe that has an impact. With that said, do be sure to let me know in the comments if you have had significantly different results. Maybe you approach Mentor Roulette differently to me. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, the most recent increase in requirements to become a mentor happened when they increased the commendations needed from 300 to 1,500. Obviously, this came alongside a requirement to have completed the role quests for tanks, healers, and at least one type of DPS. But that has been required for a while already, it's simply that it was updated to the Endwalker equivalent.